The wind had a sharp bite to it that afternoon, the kind that carried the scent of dry leaves and hinted at the frost soon to come. Samuel Carter tightened his coat against the gust, the reins firm in his calloused hands as his wagon rolled slowly into Willow Creek. The town was small, just a row of weathered buildings hugging the main street, their wooden signs creaking overhead. But it was the only place within miles to buy supplies before winter set in. Emily, his 7-year-old daughter, sat beside him, her small boots swinging above the wagon's floorboard. Her braids peeked out from under a knitted cap, and she clutched a small cloth doll in her lap. Samuel glanced at her now and then, thinking how much she resembled her late mother when she smiled. Lately, though, the smiles had been fewer. Since Margaret's passing 2 years ago, the house had been quiet, too quiet for a little girl growing up. He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the mercantile. The wind pushed a swirl of dust down the street, and that's when he saw them. A woman stood just outside the store, a worn shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her dress dust-stained and frayed at the hem. Beside her was a little girl, no more than 5, with cheeks reddened by the cold. The child's hand clung to her mother's skirt, her eyes wide and watchful. The woman, Clara, he would learn, stood tall despite the chill, her posture carrying a quiet dignity that seemed at odds with the threadbare clothes she wore. But it was her eyes that caught Samuel's attention most. They were the kind that had seen too much hardship, yet still held onto a flicker of something unbroken. He climbed down from the wagon, brushing the dust from his coat. "Afternoon," he greeted, tipping his hat. Clara gave a polite nod, her voice soft. "Good afternoon, sir." Samuel hesitated, sensing the unspoken question. Why is she standing here in the cold? He gestured toward the mercantile door. "You headed inside?" Clara's lips pressed into a faint smile. "I was just gathering the courage to ask if they needed help with cleaning or stocking shelves. Anything to earn a little food." She glanced at her daughter, who hid further behind her skirt. Samuel's brow furrowed. "You from around here?" "No." She looked past him, as if the horizon itself carried a story she wasn't ready to tell. "We came from Cedar Hollow. My husband," she paused, taking a breath as if the words themselves cost something. "He passed from fever last spring. I sold what little we had to pay the doctor, but it wasn't enough to keep the house. We've been between places since." The little girl peeked out, her eyes meeting Samuel's for a brief moment before darting away. "You've got somewhere to stay tonight?" he asked carefully. "In the freight shed behind the livery," Clara said, as though reciting a fact she had already made peace with. "It keeps the rain out." Mostly, the thought of a mother and child sleeping on cold planks in weather like this twisted something in Samuel's chest. He wanted to say more, offer something, but years of keeping his own troubles to himself had made him slow to speak. Emily's voice broke the moment. "Papa, can we get the peppermint sticks today?" she asked, looking between Clara's daughter and her own mittened hands. Samuel gave a faint smile. "We'll see, little one." He turned back to Clara. "If you need help, the mercantile's run by the Holloway brothers. They're decent folk." Clara gave a small nod, gratitude flickering in her expression. "Thank you, Mr. Carter, Samuel Carter." "Clara," she replied simply. He tipped his hat again before stepping into the store, Emily skipping ahead. Yet, even as he bartered for sacks of flour and a coil of rope, his mind wasn't on the goods. It was on the woman outside, standing in the wind with her child, refusing to bow her head even in her need. When Samuel left the store and climbed back onto the wagon, Clara and her daughter were gone. Only a faint trail of footprints in the dust marked where they'd stood. The drive home was quiet, save for the creak of the wagon wheels. Emily hummed to herself, but Samuel's thoughts were far from the road. Something about Clara's eyes, equal parts dignity and despair, had settled deep in his mind. He had a feeling he hadn't seen the last of her, and he wasn't sure he wanted to. The next day dawned gray and brittle, with a wind that rattled the loose boards of the Carter barn. Samuel had planned to spend it repairing the south fence, but Emily's cough at breakfast made him reconsider. She'd been fine the night before, yet now she sat at the table with her shoulders hunched, her face pale under the soft glow of the lantern. "Maybe you'll stay inside today," Samuel said, setting a steaming bowl of oatmeal in front of her. Emily shook her head stubbornly. "I'm fine, Papa." But she hesitated, pushing the spoon around in her bowl. "That little girl, yesterday, do you think she's warm enough? She didn't have a proper coat." Samuel looked at her, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. Emily's heart was too tender for her own good. He'd seen her give away her mittens to a neighbor's boy once, and he knew that same instinct was gnawing at her now. "I don't know, little one," he said quietly, "but I reckon I can find out." By mid-morning, Samuel had harnessed the wagon again. Emily bundled herself in her coat, scarf, and hat, whether to help or to make sure he didn't forget his promise. He couldn't tell. The road to town was muddy from a light drizzle overnight, and the horses' hooves squelched in the ruts as they made their slow way to Willow Creek. The livery stood near the edge of town, its paint peeling and its big double doors yawning open. Samuel guided the wagon around back to the freight shed Clara had mentioned. The small lean-to was nothing more than rough boards nailed together, its gaps stuffed here and there with rags to keep out the wind. Clara sat on an upturned crate just inside the opening, mending a small tear in her daughter's dress. The girl was curled beside her under a thin quilt, her head resting in her mother's lap. Samuel's gut tightened. The child's cheeks were flushed with fever. Clara looked up at the sound of the wagon wheels, her eyes wary until she recognized him. "Mr. Carter," she greeted, her voice carrying both surprise and a faint edge of caution. Samuel climbed down, reaching for a burlap sack in the back of the wagon. "Brought you something." He set it down in front of her. Inside was a loaf of bread, a small wheel of cheese, 2 apples, and an old wool blanket from his home. Clara's hand paused over her sewing. "I can't take, it's not charity," he said gently but firmly. "Call it a neighbor lending a hand. Winter's coming fast." Her lips pressed together, pride and gratitude wrestling in her expression. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice low. She adjusted the blanket around her daughter's small frame. Samuel crouched to meet the child's gaze. "What's your name, sweetheart?" The girl hesitated, glancing at her mother. "Lily," Clara said for her. Emily hopped down from the wagon, clutching a peppermint stick she'd saved from yesterday's trip. She stepped forward, shy at first, then held it out to Lily. "This is for you." Lily's eyes lit up just a little as she accepted it, murmuring a soft thank you. Clara's shoulders relaxed a fraction, watching the small exchange. Samuel stood, brushing the dust from his hands. "If you need any work, my fence line could use mending. I pay fair, and you'd have a warm meal at the end of the day." Clara looked startled, her sewing needle still between her fingers. "You'd hire me? I've only ever kept a home and worked in kitchens." "That's work," Samuel said simply. "And you strike me as someone who doesn't shy from it." Her lips curved, just slightly. "I'll think about it." He nodded, sensing her careful boundaries. "Fair enough. I'll be in town again Friday, if you change your mind." As he and Emily climbed back onto the wagon, Clara called after them. "Thank you, Mr. Carter." He tipped his hat in answer. But, as they rode away, Emily leaned against his arm. "Papa," she said softly. Lily smiled. Samuel looked down at her, then back toward the shed receding in the distance. Something about that smile and the way Clara's eyes had softened when she saw it made the cold wind feel a little less sharp. Still, as he turned the wagon toward home, he knew they couldn't stay in that shed forever. And somehow, the thought of them out there alone sat heavier with each passing mile. 3 more days passed before Samuel found himself back in Willow Creek. The November wind had turned sharper still, bringing with it the kind of cold that could sink into a man's bones. He'd meant only to pick up feed for the horses and a few sacks of flour, but as he passed the hotel, he saw Clara standing at the front desk, her shawl wrapped tight around her. She was speaking to the clerk, a rotund man with wire-rimmed spectacles, her voice low but tense. "Just a few hours a day," she was saying. "I can scrub floors, wash linens, whatever you need." The clerk shook his head. "We've got the girl from the boarding house already, and she's cheaper than I can pay you." Samuel slowed in the doorway. Clara's knuckles tightened around the edge of the counter, but she only gave a small nod and thanked the man before turning toward the exit. Her eyes caught on Samuel's, and for the briefest second, she hesitated as if she wasn't sure whether to greet him or slip away unseen. "Afternoon, Clara," he said. She gave him a small, tired smile. "Mr. Carter, do you find any work yet?" he asked gently. Her smile thinned. "Not yet. Folks are kind enough. But kindness doesn't put coins in my pocket." She glanced toward the street where Lily was sitting on the edge of the boardwalk, swinging her feet, a thin braid falling over her shoulder. Samuel followed her gaze. His own daughter, Emily, was a few paces away, crouched beside Lily and showing her how to wind a piece of twine into a cat's cradle pattern. Both girls were laughing softly, their breath making little clouds in the cold air. It struck him then how, naturally they fit together, like they'd known each other far longer than a handful of meetings. Emily, who'd been so quiet since Margaret died, was smiling the way she used to dot. Samuel cleared his throat, his voice low but steady. "I've been thinking." Clara tilted her head. "About what?" He met her gaze, and for the first time since he'd lost his wife, he spoke without skirting around the truth. "About how your daughter needs a home, and how my daughter, she wants a mother." The words hung between them, raw and unpolished. Clara blinked. Clearly caught off guard. "I'm not talking about pity," he continued. "I'm talking about something that could be good for all of us. You need stability. I need help raising Emily." And maybe he paused, searching her face. "Maybe we could find a way forward together." Clara's fingers tightened on the edge of her shawl. "You're talking about marriage." "I am," Samuel said plainly. "Not tomorrow, not without knowing each other better, but with the intention of building something steady, something honest." She looked away, her gaze fixed on the girls. "Mr. Carter, I don't know you, not really. And marriage, that's not something I can agree to out of desperation. My daughter's already lost her father. I won't risk her heart again unless I'm sure." Samuel nodded slowly. He respected that. "I wouldn't expect you to say yes today. I just wanted you to know, the offer's there. You'd have a warm roof, food on the table, and a man who'd treat you with respect. Her throat worked, as if she was swallowing hard. Why? She asked quietly. Why offer this to me? He hesitated, then answered simply. Because I see the way you love your little girl. And because I see the way Emily looks at you like she's hoping you'll stay. Clara's eyes softened for just a moment before she looked away. I need time to think, she said. Take all the time you need, he replied, his voice calm. I'll be around. Outside, the girls looked up as they stepped onto the boardwalk. Emily smiled and waved. Lily ducked her head, clutching the bit of twine like it was a treasure. As Samuel walked away, leading the wagon toward the feed store, he felt both lighter and heavier. Lighter for having spoken what had been sitting on his chest for days. Heavier because he knew the choice now rested with her. Behind him, Clara stood still, watching the place where he'd been, her hand resting protectively on Lily's small shoulder. That night, the freight shed felt colder than ever. The wind rattled the loose planks, sending fine drafts through every gap, and the air smelled faintly of hay and damp wood. Clara lay awake on the rough floorboards, her daughter curled against her under the quilt Samuel had brought. Lily's breathing was steady, but Clara's thoughts churned too fast for rest. Marriage, she'd expected Samuel Carter's kindness to be limited, maybe a few meals, a suggestion for work, or a loan of warmer clothes. But his words that afternoon had landed in her chest like a stone in a still pond, sending ripples through places she'd tried to keep calm. He hadn't sounded like a man offering charity. He'd spoken plainly, without flinching, like someone who'd already thought it through and meant every word. And that was what unsettled her most. Clara had known men who promised safety but gave only control. Her late husband had been a good man in the beginning, gentle, quick to laugh, but when the fever took hold, she'd seen how quickly life could crumble. The debt collectors that came after his death had been even harsher than the sickness. She'd fought to keep a roof over their heads, but every door had closed. Now, Samuel was offering one wide open. She turned slightly, watching Lily's sleeping face in the dim light. Her daughter's cheeks were flushed with the lingering cold, and her hair spilled over the pillow in soft tangles. Lily deserved warmth. She deserved a bed that didn't rock with every gust of wind, meals that didn't depend on whether Clara could find work that day. And yet, the idea of marrying a man she barely knew filled her with both hope and dread. Samuel had been respectful, patient, and steady in the short time she'd known him. But trust wasn't something she could summon. On command, it had to be earned. The next morning, she resolved to keep her distance for a while, to see if his offer faded as quickly as it had come. If he was the kind of man to give up when she didn't leap at the first chance, then she'd know his intentions weren't as deep as they sounded. Days passed. She found odd jobs mending shirts for the tailor, sweeping floors at the mercantile. When the Holloway brothers were short-handed, but none of them paid enough to do more than keep her and Lily fed. Each time she crossed paths with Samuel in town, he'd tip his hat, speak kindly, and leave it at that. He never pressed her, never reminded her of what he'd said. One afternoon, she spotted him on the far side of the street, hauling sacks of grain into his wagon. Emily was perched on the seat, swinging her legs and waving to Lily across the way. Clara hesitated, then lifted her hand in a small wave. Samuel's eyes met hers, briefly calm, steady, and then he returned to his work. That night, while Lily dozed off beside her, Clara thought about that steadiness. Samuel wasn't trying to charm her with grand gestures or chase her down with words. He was simply there. And the truth was, part of her liked that. Still, she needed proof. Not just of his patience, but of the kind of man he was when life wasn't neat. Anyone could be polite in town, under the gaze of neighbors. What she needed to know was how he acted when there was no one else watching. The chance came sooner than expected. Late the next week, a storm blew in from the north. Clara and Lily had been out doing laundry for Mrs. Peters at the boarding house when the rain turned to sleet. By the time they made it to the freight shed, they were soaked through, the wind cutting like a knife. Clara had just hung their wet shawls near the small brazier when the sound of wagon wheels splashing through puddles reached her ears. She peeked out to see Samuel climbing down from his wagon, a bundle tucked under one arm. Without a word, he handed it to her, a thick oilskin cloak, clearly new. Saw the weather turning, he said simply. Figured you could use this. Clara stared at the bundle, then at him. You keep showing up, she said, not accusing, just stating. He met her gaze. I keep my word, Clara, that's all. Something in his tone sank deep into her chest. She still wasn't ready to say yes, but the wall she'd built around her trust had shifted just enough to let a little warmth in. The storm had left the ground slick and shining, the ruts in the road filled with cold water that reflected the pale winter sky. Clara pulled the oilskin cloak tighter around her shoulders as she walked toward the Carter ranch for the first time. She'd agreed hesitantly to help mend the fence and prepare some of the smaller animals for the coming snow in exchange for a day's wages and a hot meal. Samuel had offered to fetch her and Lily in the wagon, but she'd refused. She wanted to arrive under her own strength, to remind herself that this was work, not charity. Still, when they reached the edge of his property and saw the sprawling pasture dotted with grazing cattle, Lily's eyes went wide. "It's so big," Lily whispered. Emily came running from the barn, her braids bouncing. "Come on, Papa says we can feed the chickens before lunch." Her hand slipped naturally into Lily's, and in moments the two girls were giggling their way toward the coop. Clara watched them go, a small knot of tension loosening in her chest. The sound of their laughter carried through the crisp air, and for a moment she allowed herself to imagine this being their life, not just a day's visit. Samuel emerged from the barn, carrying a coil of rope over one shoulder. "Fence lines this way," he said with a nod toward the pasture. "One of the posts split during the storm. Figured we could replace it before the ground freezes solid." Clara followed him, her boots crunching over frosted grass. He worked without fuss, showing her how to steady the post while he drove it into the ground, the rhythmic thud of the mallet echoing through the stillness. They didn't speak much, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. She noticed the way he checked now and then to be sure she wasn't straining, and how he offered her the heavier gloves from his own pocket when he saw her fingers reddening in the cold. By midday, they'd finished the repair. Clara brushed the dirt from her hands and straightened up, catching Samuel watching her with a faint, approving smile. "You work hard," he said simply. "I always have," she replied, her tone light but edged with truth. They made their way back to the house, where the girls were already inside, the smell of baking bread filling the air. Emily had insisted on teaching Lily how to knead dough, and the two stood at the kitchen table, their hands dusted in flour and their faces glowing with pride. Samuel leaned against the doorframe, watching them for a moment before turning to Clara. "You're welcome to stay for supper, plenty to go around." She hesitated, but the warmth of the kitchen and the sight of Lily so content made it hard to refuse. "Thank you," she said softly. Supper was simple bread, still warm from the oven, a stew rich with root vegetables and tender beef, and fresh milk from the cow Samuel kept in the barn. The girls ate heartily, and Clara found herself relaxing, her shoulders dropping as the conversation drifted between them. Samuel asked nothing probing, nothing that felt like a test. He told a few small stories about life on the ranch, and when Emily spoke, he listened as if her words were the most important thing in the room. When the meal was over, Clara moved to wash the dishes, but Samuel shook his head. "You've done enough today. Let the girls help with that." Outside, the sky was deepening to twilight, the first stars pricking through the blue. Samuel hitched the wagon to take them back into town. As they rode, the cold air bit at their cheeks, but Clara felt warmer than she had in weeks. Halfway back, the wagon wheel hit a rut, and Lily's small hand reached for Samuel's arm to steady herself. He glanced down at her, then up at Clara, his eyes soft. "She's a good girl," he said. "She is," Clara replied, her voice quiet. "I just want her to be safe, to have more than I can give her alone." Samuel didn't answer right away, but when he did, his voice was steady. "You're already giving her the most important thing, someone who loves her enough to fight for her." For the rest of the ride, Clara stared out at the passing fields, her heart unsteady. She was beginning to believe Samuel might mean what he'd said before, and maybe, just maybe, she was starting to want to believe it. The first snow came early that year, blanketing Willow Creek in a thin layer of white that crunched beneath boots and wagon wheels. Clara had begun spending more days at the Carter Ranch, helping with winter preparations. She told herself it was for the wages and the meals, but she couldn't deny the way the place felt warm, steady, and safe in a way she hadn't known in years. One morning, she arrived with Lily just as the frost was melting from the fence rails. Emily greeted them at the gate, her cheeks flushed from playing outside. Clara was just lifting a basket from the wagon when she saw him. A man leaned against the post by the main road, his coat too thin for the weather, a hat pulled low over his brow. He straightened when he saw her, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes spread across his face. "Well, if it isn't my dear sister-in-law," he said. Clara froze. "Earl," she breathed. Samuel, who had been stepping out of the barn, stopped, mid-stride at the tone in her voice. "You know him?" Earl's gaze slid to Samuel, sizing him up, her late husband's brother. "Family, you might say." His voice was oily, the kind that turned even friendly words sour. Clara clutched the basket tighter. "What do you want?" "Same thing I wanted before," Earl said, stepping closer. "You still owe me for that loan I gave your husband before he died. And I figure the interest has been piling up while you've been hiding." Samuel moved between them, his voice calm but edged with steel. "I don't think this is the place for whatever business you're talking about." Earl laughed, the sound sharp in the cold air. "And who are you?" "Her new keeper." Samuel didn't flinch. "Her friend, a man who's not going to stand by while you threaten a woman and her child." Earl's smile twisted. "Threaten? I'm just asking for what's mine." Clara's voice shook, though she stood her ground. "There was no loan, Earl. You gave my husband money to gamble, and when he lost it, you came after us. I told you then, and I'll tell you now, I don't owe you a thing." Earl's eyes hardened. "You think anyone in this town will believe you over me?" "I don't care what they believe," Samuel said evenly. You're leaving now. For a moment, it seemed Earl might argue. Then he spat into the snow, muttered something under his breath, and turned back toward the road. We'll see each other again. Clara, he called over his shoulder. When he was gone, Clara realized her hands were trembling. Samuel didn't touch her, just stood close enough that she could feel the solid presence of him beside her. All right, he asked quietly. She let out a shaky breath. I thought I'd left him behind in Cedar Hollow. I didn't think he'd bother to follow me this far. Samuel's jaw tightened. If he comes around again, you tell me. You're not alone in this. Those words, simple as they were, sank deeper than she expected. For so long, she'd fought every battle by herself. Hearing someone say she didn't have to anymore made her chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with fear. The rest of the day passed in a blur. She helped Emily and Lily gather eggs, kneaded bread beside Samuel in the kitchen, and mended a tear in his work shirt, yet all the while, her mind replayed the morning, the way Samuel had stepped forward, without hesitation, the way his voice had left no room for doubt. That night, back in the freight shed, she tucked Lily under their quilt and stared at the rafters overhead. Earl's threat still hung in her mind, but it was joined by something else, now a new, undeniable truth. Samuel Carter was a man who didn't just make promises, he kept them. And for the first time in years, Clara felt the stirrings of something dangerously close to hope. The days in Willow Creek had taken on a quiet, golden rhythm. Autumn had deepened, painting the hills in amber and russet, and the Carter ranch felt more alive than Samuel had ever known it. Clara's laughter rang out from the porch when Anna told her silly school stories. The scent of bread baking in the kitchen welcomed him home each evening, mingling with the lowing of cattle in the distance. For Samuel, it was as if the walls of the house had been warmed from the inside out. But even in the comfort of this newfound harmony, Samuel carried a weight. It wasn't a burden of regret or sorrow, it was the heavy, aching pull of something unspoken. Something he'd been turning over in his mind since the day he met Clara in front of the mercantile. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the ridge and painted the sky in rose and gold, Samuel found Clara hanging laundry near the garden. Her hair, pulled back in a loose braid, caught the light, and he couldn't help but pause. She was humming softly, her hands moving in practiced ease, the wind teasing strands of hair across her face. Clara, he called gently. She turned, shading her eyes with one hand. Evenin', Samuel, you're home early. He stepped closer, his boots crunching over the frost-tipped grass. Thought I'd quit before the light left us. Can I help? She smiled faintly. If you don't mind the danger of pinching your fingers in clothespins. Samuel helped her finish the line. In silence, the air between them was warm with familiarity, but he could feel the question he'd been holding pushing at the back of his throat. He swallowed, choosing his words carefully. Clara, you and Emma, you've been here for a while now. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. We're grateful for every day. I don't know how to repay your kindness. You've repaid it 100 times over, he said quickly. Anna's happier than I've seen her in years. The house, this place, sits different with you in it. Clara's gaze drifted to the horizon. Sometimes I worry it's too good to last. Samuel took a breath, steadying himself. It can last, if we make it last. Her eyes flicked back to his, and for a heartbeat, neither spoke. I'm not a man who dances around words, Clara, he continued, his voice steady but soft. I've been thinkin' more than thinkin'. My little girl needs a home, a woman to guide her, someone she can look up to, and I think your little girl needs more than a roof over her head. She needs a father. Clara's lips parted, slightly, but no sound came. He took a step closer. What I'm saying is, I'd be honored if you'd consider marrying me. Not out of obligation, not just for the children, though they'd be the happiest of girls in all of Willow Creek, but because I've come to care for you deeply. The wind tugged at the laundry, a sheet snapping softly in the background. Clara's hands tightened around the edge of the basket. Samuel, I don't know what to say. Say whatever is in your heart, he urged. She looked down at the grass, her voice trembling. I've been afraid to let myself hope for something like this. Afraid it would be taken away, like everything else was. He reached out, taking her hand gently in his. I'm not going anywhere, Clara. Not unless you send me away yourself. We've both known loss, but I believe we could build something. Here, steady, strong, and worth keeping. Tears welled in her eyes, and she let out a shaky laugh. You're right. Emma has already started calling you Mr. Samuel like he's a hero in a storybook. And Anna's taken to telling me secrets like I've been here all along. Samuel's heart swelled. So, is that a yes? She smiled through her tears. Yes, Samuel Carter, I'll marry you. For a long moment, they simply stood there, hands entwined, the fading sun spilling gold over their faces. Behind them, Anna and Emma's laughter drifted from the porch. Carrying on the cool evening air, it was the sound of a family already in the making. Snow had melted into rivulets along the fence posts, the first signs of spring reaching the Carter ranch. The air smelled of damp earth and budding grass, and the sun finally held warmth again. It had been nearly 4 months since Samuel asked Clara to stay not as a guest, but as a partner in raising their girls and building a life together. The wedding had been quiet, just as they both wanted. Reverend Mills had spoken the vows inside the small church, with townsfolk gathered more out of affection than curiosity. Samuel wore his only suit, the one with a mended sleeve, and Clara wore a pale blue dress Mary had insisted on helping her sew. The moment Clara said "I do," Anna had tugged at her new mother's skirt and whispered, "Does this mean we're all one family now?" Clara's tearful smile had been answer enough. Now, life moved forward not in grand gestures, but in steady rhythms. Clara brought a warmth into the house Samuel hadn't realized was missing. The kitchen smelled of fresh bread in the mornings, and the evenings were filled with the sound of the girls giggling over some shared joke at the supper table. Samuel often found himself standing in the doorway just watching them, his chest aching with a quiet, profound gratitude. Of course, ranch life had its challenges. Spring meant mending fences, tending to the new calves, and long hours out in the fields. But now, when Samuel returned home at dusk, he was met not by silence, but by the sound of boots running to the door and voices calling his name. Clara would be at the stove or seated near the fire, looking up at him with that gentle smile that always seemed to say, "You're home now." Mary and Anna had settled into their new sisterhood in a way that amazed the adults. They squabbled over whose turn it was to fetch eggs from the henhouse, but they also sat together in the barn loft, whispering about things neither Samuel nor Clara could quite hear. Clara often found them curled up together on the settee, Anna's head resting on Mary's shoulder as she read aloud from one of the few books they owned. The townsfolk of Willow Creek soon accepted the new Carter family as if it had always been. So, Mrs. Daly, the mercantile owner's wife, often said that Clara, she's made a home out of that house. And Samuel, well, I haven't seen him smile that much since before Mary was born. One crisp April afternoon, Samuel was repairing a gate near the pasture when Clara came to find him. She carried a basket covered with a cloth, the smell of warm apple pie trailing behind her. "You work too hard," she said, setting the basket on a fence post. "Thought you might need something sweet." Samuel wiped the sweat from his brow and leaned on the fence, looking at her with a steady gaze. "You've already given me everything I didn't know I needed." She tilted her head, smiling softly. "And you've given Anna a father. That's more than I ever thought she'd have." They stood there for a moment, the breeze lifting strands of Clara's hair, the cattle grazing lazily behind them. Samuel reached for her hand, rough from work but warm in his grasp. "I reckon we both came along just when the other needed it most." By summer, the ranch felt alive with more than just livestock and crops. Laughter echoed across the fields, and the porch became a favorite gathering place in the evenings. The girls chased fireflies while Samuel and Clara sat side by side in the rocking chairs, hands entwined, the day's labors fading into the golden twilight. On one such evening, Anna climbed into Samuel's lap, her small arms wrapping around his neck. "Papa," she said, the word still new on her tongue. "Did you know I wished for you before I met you?" Samuel swallowed hard, pulling her close. "Guess I must have been wishing for you too, little one." Mary leaned against Clara's chair, and Clara reached down to run her fingers through her daughter's hair. "Looks like we were all waiting for each other," she said quietly, and there it was, the truth Samuel had felt in his bones since that day in town. Life had a way of taking from you, leaving you empty in ways you thought would never heal, but sometimes, it also brought you exactly what you needed, wrapped in dust and weariness, with eyes that carried both sorrow and hope. That night, as the lantern light spilled across the porch and the stars stretched wide over the Texas sky, Samuel thought of the day he first saw Clara and Anna shivering outside the mercantile. If he'd kept on driving, he'd have missed the best thing that had ever happened to him. Now, he didn't just have a ranch. He didn't just have a daughter. He had a family, a whole, unshakable, loving family. And that, Samuel knew, was worth more than any land or cattle a man could ever own.